I want to talk to you about a lens that quite literally changed my career as a filmmaker. And that's the Canon 24-70 version 2. And coincidentally, that lens also topped the charts from lensrentals.com as the most rented lens in 2024. Now, to understand why this lens is so incredible, you have to go back to 2012 when it was released. Because at the time, prior to the release of the 5D Mark III, the highest resolution camera that Canon ever produced was the 21 megapixel 5D Mark II. Now, that sounds like it's reasonably high resolution enough at the time, but when you factor in that that was only slightly higher resolution than the film that previous Canon SLRs were shooting with, you start to realize that all of the lenses prior to this lens were designed in mind for film. Now, film had its own imperfections, and so lenses could get away with a lot. Whereas with the modern digital sensors, with a lot more cleanliness, you hear people wax on about this nowadays, that was where the 24-70 version 2 really came into its own, because it was designed for high-resolution sensors, which at the time I believe Canon was also simultaneously developing their 5DS and 5DSR, which were 50 megapixels respectively. So this lens was designed to perform under the most scrutiny of high-resolution digital sensors. Now, to bring this back into why this was such a monumental lens for me as a filmmaker, at the time I was very much just learning about what goes into making an image and making it great. And as with every other filmmaker, constantly distracted with the lenses and cameras and all the other options that come with making and telling stories. But why this lens in particular for me was huge is it got me to stop thinking about all of the different technical aspects that go into making a film and just focus on the story and the people that I was spending time with.
The children that you saw in there is the 5th generation on this farm. Back in the very beginning of the 1900s, Glenn's grandfather bought the farm.
And as a result, I've adapted this lens across 4 different cameras. I used it initially with the Canon 6D that I had back in 2015. Wonderful camera for the time, was able to create some really incredible, impactful videos with it, continuing to tell stories of farmers. Fast forwarding, I got a Sony a7R III, used that for a little while, and while going through that 2016, 2017 time frame, very much in the line of like Peter McKinnon, 120 frames a second, relying on autofocus for everything. When I got the adapter to be able to use that 24-70, start shooting with an external monitor, it really got me to think about filmmaking as an art and not just something to bang out content on the internet.
Fight this battle for me and help my unbelief.
As time went on, started to learn more about what creates the image. Still, this lens held up, using it on my Panasonic S1H, shot with that for a couple years, and then just recently, earlier this year, got a Red Komodo, and once again, I'm still adapting the Canon 24-70. Story aside, what are the things that really make this lens great? Obviously, 24-70 is one of the most used lenses on the planet. And the reason for it is the versatility. You have a nice 24 wide angle if you're shooting on full frame. 70 is a nice medium telephoto, and it looks great. And there's something about this lens that at the time, it was trying to go for a level of cleanliness and holding up to the high resolution sensors that were starting to come out. But now when I pair this lens on, my Panasonic or the Red or any of the other cameras, it seems to have like a little bit of a texture and character that you don't get with modern 24-70s. Having recently owned the Sigma 24-70 for Sony E-mount and replacing it with Sony 24-70 G Master version 2, which is arguably one of the most clinical lenses on the planet, but it lacks that character. That's where the Canon 24-70, in my opinion, still shines as an incredible lens. While this lens has definitely stood the test of time in terms of being able to use it across a wide variety of cameras, being an EF mount, it's easily adaptable to pretty much any mirrorless lens mount on the planet now. And if, like me using it on the Komodo, I use it with a speed booster, you can still get that full frame aesthetic and feel out of Super 35 and Micro Four Thirds cameras. I find it interesting that even though now Canon has their own RF 24-70, there are still a lot of people who would prefer to go for that older glass because, in my opinion, I think it just has a little bit of like a nostalgic feeling to the way that it looks. And because of the adaptability, it's a better purchase in terms of like how you plan on using it in your business, because you're not going to be stuck to using RF cameras that you can't adapt to pretty much anything else. Only side caveat to that being you can now adapt E-mount lenses to Nikon ZF mount. But that's a whole other thing, and to be honest, that doesn't make any sense to me. The way I'm talking about this lens, you probably think it's about as perfect as it gets. And it's almost there. But it doesn't come with its drawbacks. And that's why pretty much every single video shooter wishes Canon made a cinema version of this lens to address these things. First being, it's manual focus, it's a photography lens. Your focus throw is not going to be crazy. Now, since I've been shooting with this lens for close to 10 years, I've gotten really good at knowing where that focus goes and can actually manually focus with it pretty effectively. And especially using something like a 5-inch or 7-inch monitor, you can nail focus pretty accurately. The second aspect to this, and this is something that I only really discovered after shooting with it for 12 hours out on a farm one day. It was a bright sunny day. I was obviously using ND filters. To try something new, I shot the lens at 5.6 instead of 2.8. And I noticed something very interesting. When you zoom the camera from 24 to 70, there's a very massive shift in exposure. And so while I was zooming in and out all day, I was constantly having to adjust my ND filter to compensate for that change in exposure. Now, I don't know if this is a, not having the lens profile built into my Panasonic S1H or whatever the case is, but it's just something to note. And while I have the equivalent lenses from Sony and Sigma, they don't seem to have that same issue. The other thing, and this is just delving off into conspiracy theory land, but I noticed when you look down the barrel of the lens at 24, it seems like the aperture ring closes down just a little bit. And then when you zoom all the way out to 70, it opens up. And I'm wondering if that's how they somehow keep the constant 2.8 aperture by essentially having what's the equivalent of a 24mm f2 and a 70-2.8, closing it down at the 24 end so you get 28 or 2.8 throughout the whole range versus f2 to 2.8 zoom. But that's something that I don't have confirmed and would love to talk to a Canon rep about that, because I would rather have f2 on the wide end personally. If they could do a firmware update, wonderful. This is one of those lenses that you can totally get for cheap on eBay right now, and highly recommend that you add it to your kit. If you're looking for a really solid 24-70 that'll last through the ages and be able to take with you from camera to camera, if you're like me and you're hopping from brand to brand to brand, this is one of those lenses that you'll be able to continue to use regardless of what system you're shooting on. So hopefully this was a helpful little bit of an insight into this 24-70 and how much it's helped shape me as a filmmaker, being able to focus on story and rather than gear, and having that level of consistency. Whereas, everyone on YouTube is constantly switching out cameras, lenses, gear, all this stuff. And it's something that I do too. But having that thing that you can come back to that's consistent, that you know what it looks like, is going to be huge, because it'll allow you to execute on your vision and the stories you want to tell, rather than just getting caught up in the next hype cycle around equipment. So hopefully this was helpful for you today. And, glad to be back and recording on YouTube. See you guys in the next video.